Hello everybody, it's my pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Vladimir Milov, a former Deputy Energy Minister under the Kasyanov government, and currently one of the leading political leaders of the political opposition in Russia. I'm glad to see that we have friends from the economics department and from the political science department, so we don't have only international students this year. And so today Dr. Milov will be speaking about his, he will be giving us his personal take on the current major issues affecting Russia's energy sector, with some excursus on the reforms that have been carried out in the 90s and in the years of 2000s. So without further ado, I will give you the floor, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much. Is it working?
If it's not, you can use this one.
I'm not sure. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here again. I think we have much bigger hall this time than last time. And of course, energy is a fascinating topic, which is not only vital to Russia's economy and life, but it's also key to understanding the philosophy of modern Russia, where it goes, how it works. And I will try to briefly, systematically explain the main trends and developments and future perspectives of the Russian energy sector, and also try to explain what does it mean for strategy of the country and development of the country. Let me start with just a brief introduction of my personal role in development of the Russian energy industry, which would give you probably a slightly better understanding of why am I standing on certain positions and opposing the other ideas, which will be evident from my presentation. I used to work in the Russian government about 10, 12 years ago, in a very fascinating time, a period of a big policy crossroads. Not only in connection to the energy sector as such, but general policy crossroads for the country as well. I used to represent the camp within the decision-making community, which argued that we need more openness, more diversity, more competition, more private investment and private initiative. And there was the other camp which was arguing that we need more centralization of control, we need vertical integration, we need government heavily involved in decision making, and we need government and state-controlled companies, so-called national champions, to be given a priority in development of energy resources. So basically the big policy crossroads a decade or more ago was about that, about choosing that model of development, whether we will be going down the road of competition, encouraging openness, open markets, private initiative, or we're going to centralize everything under government control. To put it simply, this was largely about that. Now, after more than 10 years have passed, you have a clear idea which camp have won. But what am I going to do in my speech? I'm going to analyze the results of the model chosen, which was clearly connected with greater centralization and government involvement, contrary to what I have hoped for when I used to work at the government and a lot of my colleagues. And frankly speaking, contrary to what have been said in the first economic program of the Russian government, which was initially published in summer 2000, immediately after Vladimir Putin was first inaugurated as Russian president. I'm sure a lot of you know about this, but those who don't, I strongly advise to go and analyze what have been said in this strategic economic development plan, which went by the name of either Kasyanov program under the name of Prime Minister at the time, who promoted a lot of reforms, or Grev program under the name of German Gref, then economic minister of Russia, who was behind most of the provisions of the program, was the main developer of it. Actually, this program, it was a vital instrument of economic policy during the first presidential term of Vladimir Putin, and it didn't say a word about strengthening government control, about the need to monopolize everything, about the need for national champions. No. So this big U-turn in policy, not only in energy, but energy somehow found itself on the forefront of this big political thinking change. This big U-turn have actually happened during the process of driving. Initially, when Vladimir Putin was sworn in as president and the new government was appointed under him back in 2000, everything that was announced was very open, very competitive, very liberal. There was not a single sign that further centralization might occur, which basically had instigated a lot of foolish, rosy hopes with folks like me, who had invested myself in the idea that everything that this government program had said was actually true. Turned out that it didn't. But, you know, just to give you an idea, we have been talking preliminarily with colleagues right before the start of this lecture, and I mentioned a very simple issue which serves as an illustration to that. You know that right now we have the biggest oil-producing company in Russia named Rosneft, which is symbolizing the idea of one of those national champions we have been talking for a long period, and is one of the biggest oil companies in the world, obviously. But at the time being, 11 years ago, when I was Deputy Minister of Energy, we had been, it's very hard to imagine now, but we have been sitting down there in the office of German Gref, the economic minister at the moment, and discussing in very practical terms, when shall we include Rosneft in the government privatization plan? And it was not about should we or should we not. It was about should we do it in 2003 or 2004 the latest. Not to mention that Rosneft itself was producing less than 10% of Russian oil output at the moment, and was actually considered to be, bad remains of the oil sector, with the best pieces obviously grabbed by oligarchs who participated in privatization, but Rosneft was something which was left like crumbs from the table. That was the time. And frankly speaking, privatization was going on very intensively. New market reform and unbundling concepts for energy industries were intensively discussed, and some of them were implemented in the government. But then, gradually but surely, this big U-turn have happened. The state made very big and in a lot of ways unannounced comeback into the energy industry, started to re-establish control over assets, started to retake the assets and renationalize the assets of the private industry, started to play a bigger role in regulation, planning, investment, control of what is happening in the energy industry. We did have high hopes that a large part in the development of Russian energy would be played by major international companies, foreign direct investments. It did not turn to be the case. Foreign companies have been one by one squeezed out of many important projects. Some of them which have tried buying equity shares in the big vertical integrated Russian companies, like German E.ON and Gazprom or Konica and Lukoil, have left, sold off their stakes, left the country. So what we have it's obvious, I won't spend too much time describing it because I'm sure you know about all these developments. What happened is that the government had reinstated itself as the big champion of the energy industry, which defines its future, which controls a lot of important decisions, determines investment policy, development policy, and so on. What is important is that right now, despite limited capability to do it, because the government controls a lot of the media and it never hesitates to pursue its propaganda, but I'm insisting that now it is time to reevaluate the consequences and aftermath of this big comeback of the state in the energy industry. I'd say 10 years, and I say 10 years because 2003 was clearly a date when the government had shown early signs that it's coming back and it's not letting further reform to go through. Putin had openly announced that for the first time ever in February 2003 that he is against the idea of market restructuring and unbundling of Gazprom, which was the initial idea of Kasyanov government. Putin was silent on the issue for a while, but then in 2003 he openly voiced his negative view about market unbundling of Gazprom. In 2003 was the beginning of the first takeovers of privately owned energy assets by state companies. It began with the acquisition of a company called Severnaya Neft by Rosneft. Rosneft, which was previously only selling its assets away, started to buy back. 2003 obviously had also marked the beginning of UCAS affair, which ultimately ended up with takeover of UCAS assets. So I'd say 2003 is a good starting point, historical starting point to mark the beginning of the processes of reinstating the government in the Russian energy industry. Basically, it means that already 10 years, more than 10 years have passed since this policy U-turn. So it is time to evaluate the ultimate results. And I think we have to do it bearing in mind that a Russian energy industry is now in a totally different shape than it was 10 years ago. It has at least two major new challenges which was not completely visible, or maybe visible but didn't really start to bite back then a decade ago. First challenge is a shift from a brownfield era in upstream energy resources production to a greenfield era. A brownfield era means that the bulk of output was coming from the fields which were already introduced in operation or were relatively low cost as far as investments were concerned, because they were close to developed infrastructure in Western Siberia where everything already existed. You just needed to connect a new greenfield to a pipeline, and basically that was it. Now, what is so different now is that we have only new fields left, green fields to replace the depleted potential of the bulk of existing upstream fields, which are located in a very remote, difficult areas, particularly so difficult as the Pacific or Arctic offshore, where Russian companies have virtually no experience of working and where it's terribly complicated to develop oil and gas resources. It is associated with a totally different level of costs, absolutely not even comparable to the traditional areas like onshore Western Siberia and Khanty-Mansiysk region. Just to drill one exploratory well in the Russian Arctic might cost you like 30-50 million US dollars. An absolutely unimaginable figure for drilling exploratory wells in traditional Western Siberia areas of production. So actually the greenfield challenge means that we cannot deliver big new volumes of production from the fields where it's relatively low cost, which are located close to existing infrastructure. We have to go out there somewhere in the wilderness in a totally different conditions, which are far more costly, which require absolutely different level of technology. And this greenfield challenge obviously increasingly raises the stakes in government investment stimulating policy. It's very difficult to develop these new fields, and it's becoming a much more responsible job for the government to do that. We're going to talk about that a bit later, how is it done today, but this is a challenge we didn't have 10 years ago, because 10 years ago it was relatively easy to increase production of energy resources in the existing brownfield areas where it was much less costly. Now, the other challenge, which is a relatively new development, but it might bear very significant long-term consequences on the Russian energy industry, it is a very rapid development of international competition, particularly in the oil and gas industries, which was totally unexpected in a lot of ways before, because like 10 years ago, there was a general perception among policymakers in Russia that, let me give you a couple of figures. For instance, the countries which produce about 90% of global GDP at the same time control only about 10% of global proven hydrocarbon reserves. This big energy dependence club, energy importers club, unites such different countries and nations like United States, China, European Union, Japan, India. They are all in the energy dependence club, basically controlling very small fraction of global hydrocarbon reserves. At the same time, countries which produce only 6% of global GDP, which is basically Russia and the countries of OPEC, Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, control about 2/3 of global hydrocarbon reserves. See, this is a huge imbalance which was suggesting the idea that was mainstream 10 years ago, that the future energy markets will be sellers' markets, that import dependence of major, the biggest economies in the world will grow, and that the role of smaller countries which are at the same time controlling most of the resources, be it Russia or Venezuela or Saudi Arabia, will increase, because importing markets will, run around hunting for their resources and competing, standing in line to beg for more oil and gas and so on. That was the vision, that was the concept. It was also mainstream in the Russian government. It turns that the reality is very, very different from that picture, and that is also the price oil and gas producing countries are paying for a period of unexpectedly high prices for oil. These high prices made profitable new projects which were non-economic before, particularly associated with development of difficult non-conventional resources like tight oil, shale gas, which basically had brought about a lot of series of different energy revolutions in the world, key outcome of which is increasing competition at the international oil and gas markets, which puts traditional oil and gas producers like Russia in a previously unexpected and much more difficult position. Its decision makers have thought that, well, the dependence on the rest of the world on oil and gas will only increase, and everybody will be standing in line and begging us for more oil and gas. Prices will grow, $200 a barrel, $500 a barrel, sky is the limit. The reality is very different, and the environment is turning out to be much more competitive. And these revolutions, technological revolutions which are happening in the oil and gas world, they are just not limited to one issue. It's a systemic process which is pretty well connected in different areas. For instance, we have been speaking about, you heard, I'm sure, about the peak oil theory, which was very heavily promoted by conservative geologists and petroleum specialists, which suggested a very simple thing that inevitably at certain point oil production in specific regions and then subsequently in the world should peak, and after which it can only decline. And the classical story which was referred to was the United States oil industry, which did indeed peak in its conventional oil production in 1970, after which the output have steadily declined. But then we see a big turnaround in recent years, starting from 2005, 2006, correct me if I'm wrong in dates, we saw a very sharp increase in the United States oil output. So King Hubert peak theory proved that, there's a slightly new, different development, totally unexpected. We are actually now heading not towards further decline, but rather towards a second peak. US oil output in the recent years, again, correct me if I'm wrong in detailed numbers, but had grew about 20%. And actually, together, for instance, with higher energy efficiency of US economy and implications of the economic crisis as well, what we see is a huge shrinking of US net imports for oil. And it's not only the consequence of the crisis, because a lot of what is contributing is associated with intentional policy, for instance, that had helped to find a magic silver bullet, which we have been, particularly people in oil import dependent countries, have been searching for. An idea on how to replace the total domination of oil in the transportation sector. Oil was unchallenged dominant in the supplies of the different segments of transportation sector. However, the process that we see at the moment is very intensive replacement of oil in transport with natural gas. Public transport, trucks, particularly promoted by specifically governments which do help to, with a lot of measures, governments of oil import dependent countries, they do help a lot with stimulating measures for public transportation and for heavy cargo automobile transport to transfer to natural gas as a fuel. That is yet another revolution which is taking place, a revolution in the oil consuming sector, gas to oil transfer, which have led to certain experts predicting, for instance, for the first time in my memory, that at certain point in time, not far, we might experience such a development as peak oil demand. And for instance, this year, there was a report published by a group of analysts by Citigroup, which has a perfect team of oil and gas analysts headed by Edward Morse, which was called Global Oil Demand, the end is nigh. If you want me, I can send you a link to that for those of you who are not familiar. Now, based on these trends in replacing oil with natural gas in the transportation sector, Citigroup analysts had predicted that sometime around 2020, maybe later, global oil demand, not output, not production, but instead the demand might peak because of a very intensive replacement of oil with alternative sources of fuel. And then you have to refer yet even to another revolution, which is obviously the revolution in natural gas production that is called the shale revolution in the US, a rapid development of non-conventional natural gas production, which had absolutely transformed the face of the international gas market. So what you see is opportunities for traditional oil and gas producing and exporting countries basically shrinking, because importers have found ways to develop their own non-conventional resources of oil and gas and significantly manage and bring down demand with introducing not only energy efficiency but substantially replacing gas with oil with natural gas in the transportation sector. This is the gas to oil switch in the transportation sector. If you take a look, it happens virtually everywhere. Not only United States and European Union, but there is a very, very intensive development and government program to assist the transfer to natural gas as a fuel for motor vehicles in China. It is in very big detail described, for instance, in the Citigroup report, which I'm referring to. So, summarizing all this, the picture of total dependence of the whole world on Russian oil and gas, which seemed more or less realistic and particularly exciting for policymakers in this country like 10 years ago, it basically vanishes in front of our eyes. What we see is bigger competition, bigger opportunity for traditionally energy import dependent countries to escape extra dependence, still continue to buy oil and gas from international markets, but escape the situation of total domination of 1, 2, 3, few small number of big producers. Market is rapidly transforming with all this sequence of different energy revolutions basically in front of our eyes. So if you take a look at the implications for the Russian energy industry, what you see are two very important trends. On one hand, it is becoming much more difficult and much more costly to produce new energy, new oil, new gas in our country because of the greenfield challenge, because of the expiration of the brownfield potential. And yet, on the other hand, you have much bigger pressure from the international markets, which become far more competitive and which basically offer more and more alternatives to consumers who are not anymore wishing to stand in line begging for Russian gas. If you take a look at how practically these implications work, I just strongly advise you to get a glance on how catastrophically, I would stress this word again, catastrophically, Gazprom have lost European market in the past 5 years. 5 years ago, at our peak year of supply, we have been supplying Europe beyond the former USSR borders with over 150 BCM of gas per year. And that was a record amount, which we have never sold before. And Gazprom top managers were running around with presentations which showed graphs that after some years this is going to grow to 200 BCM per year, 220, and then only sky is the limit. What you see, if you take a look at the official Gazprom figures of supply of gas to certain European countries, is that after these 5 years, after 2008 peak, we have lost about a third of the amount supplied to Europe in this peak year. And, you know, my personal guess is that we will never come back to the level of 2008. We'll be only crawling around somewhere close to the current level of supplies. Gazprom traditionally blames it on the economic crisis in the euro area, which is not a really good explanation, given the fact that our competitors like Qatar or Norway at the same time have gained at the European market and significantly increased their share of presence and also as well the absolute volume. Whereas Russia, for instance, have completely lost supplies to countries like Belgium or Croatia. These countries have ceased to buy Russian gas. They have been buying certain volumes before, now they buy zero. Not very difficult to explain why, because they have been intensively constructing LNG terminals for imports. Most of the European countries, with very few exceptions like UK or Turkey or Poland, most other countries have been dramatically reducing purchases of Russian gas in the past 5 years, simply because of greater competition at the European market. A competition which was a direct implication of US shale revolution. North American market has virtually closed down for imports. A lot of new LNG volumes have been redirected to the European market. More volumes are on the way, so the competition is not going anywhere. The European market is also transforming itself in a lot of ways because it's becoming better interconnected. New pipeline interconnections are being built. Particularly Western Europe is being very successful in developing an underground storage capacity in gas supplies, which adds a lot of flexibility to the market. There's been certain success to the efforts of the European regulators to introduce more transparent and competitive environment at the European gas trade. So actually what we are seeing is that at the moment Gazprom, particularly in Western Europe, has to operate in an extremely competitive environment, something totally contrary to what it initially hoped for, because for many years, and frankly speaking, I still do not see very much alternative to that, Gazprom's main marketing philosophy was resting on the idea of concluding long-term take-or-pay gas supply contracts, 20, 30 years with fixed price formulas, which basically is an absolute alternative to an open competitive environment. This was even incorporated into official ideas of Russian international energy policy. There is, for instance, an interesting document I strongly advise you to find, which was published by then President Dmitry Medvedev at the Kremlin official website on the 21st of April 2009. It was called Russian Suggestions on the Principles of International Energy Cooperation, which was seen as nothing less as an alternative to the Energy Charter Treaty by Russian officials. Fortunately, this document was rapidly forgotten and never went anywhere, but it's very interesting to have a look just to get an understanding of the philosophy of Russian self-promotion at the international energy markets. It's a very short, like 3-page document, which talks about issues like predictability of demand, that suppliers should receive long-term guarantees from consumers to be able to promote their project and so on. It did not exactly include the word Gosplan. This word was not there, but the spirit was clearly present. It gave a very clear idea of what Russian top decision makers want from the international markets, to become more and more resemblant of the Soviet planned economy. Give us predictable demand, plan your economic development for a 5-year period, then another 5-year period, and based on that predictable demand, conclude a predictable 20, 30-year long-term contract. This is exactly how Soviet economy had worked. However, it has such little relevance to practical reality that this document never went anywhere. But if you are looking for an explanation why Russia had so significantly lost its share at the European gas market in the past 5 years, here's the explanation why. The philosophy, which turned to be completely outdated in a new, rapidly changing competitive environment. Now, frankly speaking, the big question is whether this system, which we have been building in the energy sector in the past 10 years, actually fits to address these 2 new major challenges: growing international competition and much bigger difficulties in developing our own greenfield potential. Now, let's try to answer that question in a yes or no mode. Let's have a look in more detail. Let's have a look at the greenfield situation. For instance, 2003 is a sort of an anniversary year, not because of the few events which I just mentioned, beginning of UCAS affair, beginning of takeovers by Rosneft, abandoning the idea of Gazprom unbundling, but there was also another important development, another very important decision made by the government in 2003. It was basically the decision to abolish and discontinue all the negotiations with foreign investors about development of the Russian offshore fields and give the monopoly to Gazprom and Rosneft. For instance, negotiations on Sakhalin-3 were halted, and some other potential PSAs in the offshore too. And Gazprom and Rosneft were given initially the informal monopoly on development of the Russian offshore oil and gas fields. But in 2008, actually in April 2008, then outgoing President Vladimir Putin had formally signed this monopoly into law. A law which currently is effective and which says that only a company with more than 50% government control can develop Russian offshore fields. Now let's have a look. In the mid-90s, we have concluded our first production sharing agreements with foreign investors to develop offshore deposits at Sakhalin. Sakhalin 1, Sakhalin 2. These production sharing agreements were widely criticized in the society. We'll yet come up to this point in more detail. But it is very important that these projects are up and running, delivering oil and gas. In disregard of incredible complexity, for instance, Sakhalin 1, operated by Exxon and partners, have included several world record wells which were drilled, extremely complicated horizontal wells and so on. This was all done in very complicated, difficult Arctic conditions. These projects also involved building a first ever Russian LNG plant within the framework of Sakhalin 2 projects. So as far as the legacy of production sharing agreements run by foreign investors is concerned, we have significant achievements which we can physically see. They are materialized, the results is out there. Oil is produced, gas is produced, revenues are flowing in, taxes are paid, huge taxes, by the way. What's the result of giving away the monopoly of development of the Russian offshore to Gazprom and Rosneft? It is largely a rhetorical question. You know about a lot of issues. You know about Stockman project brought to a halt. You know about Prirazlomная story recently attacked by Greenpeace activists. Prirazlomная is I do not support what Greenpeace did. I think it's actually hazardous to act like that on a complicated object like this. But Prirazlomная at the same time is also not the project that Russia should be proud of. It was done for almost 20 years, and still first oil is not produced. It's been constantly delayed. The platform which is installed out there is a combination of an extremely expensive and basically unfinished Soviet, what we call Dolgostroy. I'm not even sure how to translate that into English, but Dolgostroy means when you are building something for far too long, decades and decades and decades, and you still cannot finish it. It's, a bit like Sputnik. Russians, when you say Dolgostroy, Russians perfectly understand what it is about. Platform, the base for a platform at Prirazlomная was built for many years at the Sevmash factory in Severodvinsk. but then it was unfinished and the decommissioned, outdated top of Norwegian platform was attached to it. This project is still not producing oil. Sakhalin, what else is there working? Now, recently we saw, finally, after all these years, we saw certain developments with Kirinsky block, but basically most of the remaining Sakhalin projects which were given away under control of Rosneft and Gazprom, they never went anywhere, at least not to anything compared to Sakhalin 1 or Sakhalin 2. So we don't see huge breakthrough here. We don't see huge breakthrough in development of Russian offshore potential by state-run companies. We do have certain offshore progress and new discoveries and development of marine offshore production in North Caspian. But it is mostly achieved by the hands of the private oil company, Lukoil, not the state-controlled oil champions. So, frankly speaking, some of you might want to argue with me, you might have a different vision, different concept, and this is perfect because I very much encourage open public debate, but if you are aware of certain achievements of Russian state-controlled oil and gas companies in development, new greenfield potential, for instance, of the offshore areas, please share it with me. I might have better knowledge about that. At the moment, it seems that it was a kind of a lost decade for development of Russian greenfield offshore potential. Particularly, there is one even more important point, because I do not work for the government anymore. I'm a politician and I consider myself to be a statesman. I very strongly promote national interests of the Russian Federation as I see them. And for instance, when we had a debate about production sharing agreements, Sakhalin 1, Sakhalin 2, Kharyaga and others back 10 years ago, it was widely argued that these PSAs are allegedly disadvantages for the state because the state does not get enough taxes paid. However, so again, we go back to 2003, which was a very important turning policy point. Also, a legislation was adopted back in 2003, which virtually killed production sharing agreements. It did not close the whole opportunity anyway to conduct new PSAs. But it had imposed a lot of additional taxation on operators of this agreement, which made it virtually senseless from the economic point of view. So the date of death of PSA regime in Russia is also 2003, not coincidentally. So frankly speaking, let's have a look at what we have right now. If you browse Russian business media, Russian oil and gas media, reports about developments of new greenfield projects, what you'll get is an avalanche of news of these projects getting huge, generous tax breaks and tax exemptions from the state. So, frankly speaking, what we had is not a replacement of some regime which was allowing investors more flexibility and granting it some tax breaks from the government to stimulate investment, which was PSA, with a regime which obliges everybody to pay taxes. No. What we've had is basically changing one form of tax exemptions to another, but this time far worse for the strategic interests of Russian Federation, because production sharing agreement is about sharing the profitable oil and gas produced after your costs are compensated. So in this system, in the production sharing agreement system, the government and the investor basically share the risk of future oil and gas prices. If they are high, both share the bonanza. If they are low, government and the investor share the risk. Now, what is happening if you don't have PSA, but you have tax breaks as now? It means that the government voluntarily says to the investor, I don't want tax revenues, at least in this volume designated by law from this specific project. I grant it to you, give it away, it's yours. So if the price is low, which I completely understand the motivation of oil and gas companies. They operate, when they do the project design, they operate under very conservative price assumptions, which they should do, because oil and gas prices might go down. There's a significant risk. You have to be conservative in this type of business. But if the prices are high and you still have tax breaks, it means that the bonanza is not shared by government and investor. It means it goes solely 100% to the investor, which is now mostly government-controlled companies. Now, some of you might think that control over oil and gas companies brings extra revenues to the government budget. That is just not the case. That is just not the case. One simple exercise, which all of you can afford, it's very easy to do. Go online, find the IFRS financial reports of Russian oil and gas companies. What you will see is that, for instance, private companies like Lukoil or TNK-BP, which was private until this year when it was acquired by Rosneft, had paid on average $2 or $3 per barrel in dividends to their shareholders annually. $2 or $3 per barrel of oil equivalent produced. Rosneft or Gazprom Neft, $1 or less. If you take a look, for instance, at the income of Russian consolidated budget, you will see we have these huge pieces of property primarily associated with the oil and gas industry. You'll see that income from ownership of state property and privatization is less than 3% of the total income of the Russian consolidated budget. It's just above like 500 billion rubles a year, which is mostly coming from sales of some smaller government-owned property, like Morskoy seaport Vadina, for instance, not the proceedings from the oil and gas industry. What you see is 75% of shares of Rosneft and almost 11% of shares of Gazprom is owned not directly by the Russian government, but by a very vague intermediary structure named Rosneftegaz, which was, until this year, for a long period of time, in accordance with Vladimir Putin's decrees, exempt from paying dividends to the state budget, after which it had accumulated huge money on its bank accounts, deposits, and now this intermediary structure runs around the market trying to buy assets using this money, which should be in the federal budget in the first place, not in the hands of some murky officials who, for some reason, became an intermediary with the ownership of major state oil and gas assets. So, did this centralization of control bring any good to the income of the Russian people, Russian state? No. If somebody disagrees, I want the proof. Did we achieve anything with development of new greenfield potential? Well, there are a few exceptions, like Vancouver field. One case. Will be interesting to hear other examples. Let's have a look at the other issues, very important issues. It's quite clear to see how rapidly, for instance, the global LNG market is growing, adding a lot of flexibility to the potential of gas exporters. It had grown several times in the past 20 years. It's continuing to grow. It's the biggest segment of international gas trade as far as growth is concerned, obviously. Does Russia succeed in development of LNG? Yeah, we have a lot of projects which are part of them on paper, some of them at the early implementation stage, but we still have only one plant built by private hands within the framework of, and importantly speaking, foreign hands, within the framework of Sakhalin-2 project. There's been multiple plans and ideas of building LNG plants within Gazprom. Kharasavy LNG at Yamal, it was abandoned at the early stage 10 years ago. Baltic LNG, it was abandoned. There was a lot of other discussions which are still largely on paper, but the only LNG plant in Russia which is up and running is built by private foreign investors. So did state companies add something to that development? But not so far. Let's have a look at the other, but I already told you about lost European market at the same time when Russia's competitors Norway and Qatar have gained. Let's have a look at other developments. Russian energy relations with Central Asia. 10 years ago, Russia was the only country which was buying gas from Turkmenistan, a country with vast gas resources. Now, we see that Russia is occupying a third place in the list of importers of Turkmen gas, being outpaced not only by China, which had successfully built a gas pipeline from Turkmenistan, but also by Iran. Now, this gas pipeline from Turkmenistan is also a very intriguing story, because former Turkmenistan President Saparmurat Niyazov had signed a preliminary agreement about supplies of 30 BCM of gas to China in April 2006, just 3 weeks after Vladimir Putin signed similar 30 BCM preliminary agreement also in Beijing, also with the same Chinese companies. 2006, spring 2006. Now Turkmen pipeline is up and running for many years now. It was launched 4 years ago, and China is now, via this pipeline, is the bigger consumer of Turkmen gas. Negotiations between Russia and China on gas supplies are still underway, not finished. No contractual agreement signed. Well, a big question is, has this model of centralization of control in the energy industry had brought us any success? Has it brought us any advantages? Is it opening a future pattern for successful development of the energy industry, particularly given the experience of the past 10 years? What we see right now, at the moment, are Russian companies which are either controlled by the state or indirectly affiliated by the state, basically running around trying to find international partners which will basically receive a minority equity share in certain projects, at the same time taking a lion's share of investment, exploration, and development expenditures, and bringing in technology which Russian state companies currently lack. Just take a look, for instance, at the Rosneft-Exxon cooperation in the Kara Sea, or Black Sea. So, to me, what I have to say is that I think, again, it is time to reevaluate the efficiency of the state-controlled model in the energy industry. I think it has clear shortcomings, and its impact should be analyzed openly, not hidden behind the facade of rhetoric about the efficiency of state national champions, which is just a facade to me. At the same time, let me give you a couple of different other stories, which is a very good comparison if you want to analyze the different structural patterns for government policy. We've had an experience of certain parts of energy industry significantly privatized and also open to foreign capital. It was largely oil producing sector and coal producing sector. The latest issue is vitally important, because this is when earlier this year I was given a speech about this in Siberia, in one of the coal producing regions of Irkutsk, And I understood that a lot of people who listened to me, including a lot of important scientists, academics, they said, we didn't realize that this coal industry development story had such a consequences and such an impact. They said it should be promoted as a huge success story by the Russian government. Why is it not? I gave my answer. It suggested that although coal industry reform was a huge success story of the Russian energy industry, it follows a totally different philosophy, contrary to what Vladimir Putin's government is promoting. Instead of centralization, verticalization, monopolization, and state control, Russian coal industry was completely privatized. Government virtually left it during the 90s, giving it away to private capital and competition. Now, let me show you a few consequences that were achieved. In the beginning of 1990s, coal industry was the biggest headache of Soviet government. Arguably, minor strikes in Kemerovo region were one of the major factors that contributed to political decline of the government of Mikhail Gorbachev. Not to mention that the government subsidies to the coal industry were over 3% of GDP, because the whole industry was loss-making, and government had to subsidize it to, ensure a living and survival for mining enterprises. During the reform, a lot of loss-making mines and enterprises were intentionally closed. A lot of them were privatized. The industry was completely given away to private hands. What happened is that labor productivity just within 10 years have doubled. Government subsidies had reduced to zero. Coal industry for more than 10 years now is only receiving state subsidies for continuing closure of the remaining inefficient mines and resolving certain social issues. For more than 10 years now, there is no such thing as direct subsidization of enterprises which continue to operate. What have happened for the first time ever in Russian history, Russia became a net exporter of coal in 1997. Before that, Russian Federation within the Soviet Union, and then subsequently independent Russian Federation, was always a net importer of coal, because the bulk was produced in Kazakhstan and Ukraine. Since 1997, we are a net exporter of coal. We produce more than we consume. Moreover, after some period of time, we have managed to occupy the third place in the rank of biggest international market coal exporters. We are only outplayed by Australia and Indonesia, and we had in turn outplayed such important players and international suppliers as China, South Africa, Vietnam, and others. So this coal industry story completely got rid of subsidies, incredibly improved efficiency, entered international markets and became a major player, something which we never have been before. That is a huge success story achieved only through one very plain instrument: privatization, encouraging private initiative, private investment, and competition. That is achieved, that is done within 20 years. Let's also have a look at the experience of our oil producing industry. Russian oil industry is a long story. It deserves multiple specific lectures, but I will try to explain you in a few words. When most of the Russian oil production were in private hands, before actually the takeover of Yukos effectively had begun, during 5 years since 2000 to 2004, the average growth of oil output in Russia was 8.4% a year. Since 2005, it had brought down to average growth slightly above 1%. That is actually the price we paid for nationalization, Now, some people would wrongly argue that this impressive growth of early 2000s was happening because of, the propaganda has multiple explanations. Because of a very, very easy, legacy, easy brownfields with a lot of idle wells that just needed to be introduced in operation, or some barbaric, as they say, methods of production used by oil companies and so on. I'll give you just a few figures, which is part of the official statistics. You can have a look at Rosstat numbers. The number of idle wells not in operation, in 2000 and 2005 comparatively, was relatively same percentage. It was like somewhere in between 12 and 15%. It was not that we had a lot of idle wells and we just started to pump oil. No. Another important illustration is that one of the key projects which had given a lot of boost to Russian oil output, for instance, was development of Priobskaya oil field by Yukos. Priobskaya oil field was a huge potential oil field during the 90s, and different ideas of cooperating with foreign investors and concluding production sharing agreements were discussed. However, in 97-98, oil company Yukos, which was private by the time, had decided to develop it on its own, with its own investment, not attracting any foreign investors. It had invested more than $2 billion in the project, and Priobskaya field, which was giving zero production in 97-98, or very small numbers of output, it had produced more than 20 million tons a year by the time Yugansk-Neftegas, the main subsidiary of Yukos, was taken over in 2004-2005. And all this new additional output basically went into the hands of Rosneft. It's not a story of using a good legacy of the past, so-called long-hanging fruit. It's an issue of investment. And particularly, what is also important for you to know, that you should take a look at this. My best friend is the Russian official statistics bulletin. Take a look at this Rosstat numbers. They will explain everything to you. Just take a look at the boost of capital investment in Russian oil production upstream from 2000 to 2004. The output growth which we had achieved at the time was an investment growth. It was not to some extent it was a low-hanging fruit because infrastructure was there. But basically what we had achieved was achieved by increasing investment, dramatically increasing investment. A lot of new flash of windfall money from rising oil prices were in fact reinvested. Most of it was reinvested by the private oil industry in boosting production. There was also a huge surge in productivity. The average productivity of one oil well had increased by about 1/3, again from 2000 to 2004. So, frankly speaking, I have to say that we do have a very successful story of development of competitive private sector with significant share of foreign investment in the Russian energy industry. We have the coal industry story. We have the boost of oil output brought about by investment and increased productivity in early 2000s. We have Lukoil developing the North Caspian. We have foreign investors developing Sakhalin-1 and Sakhalin-2. Now, I wish we had this list of success stories on the part of state-controlled companies, but we don't. That's the problem. Particularly having a look at their recent behavior on the international markets, where they are largely, state companies are basically in denial of these new competitive trends. They're saying that, oh, shale revolution is a bubble. It will soon burst out. And we're going to be back to $500 per 1,000 cubic meters, says Mr. Miller, CEO of Gazprom. We still have marketing policy which is largely based in gas industry on the idea of long-term. take-or-pay contracts which are virtually outdated. So the big question is that revisiting the model of state control, monopoly, and government leading role of national champions in the energy industry, I think that given this complicated new environment that we have, lack of experience of working in the offshore fields, lack of technology, inability to convert huge windfall profits into successful investment, well, I don't think this model which we have developed over past 10 years exactly fits into the challenges that Russian energy sector is facing. Most definitely, my view is biased because I'm one of the parties in that strategic rivalry over ideas on how to develop it. But I also think I'm right, and I think I have presented enough factual evidence during this presentation to support my theory. We'll be happy to take your questions.
Thank you. Okay, do we have any questions from the audience?
No questions.
Go on, don't be shy. Okay, thank you.
I have
I think there's
a
also,
question.
there's also one here.
Okay.
Last week, the government passed a bill that will liberalize LNG export, and it's expected to be signed into law. It seems that this would have the effect of increasing competition between Gazprom and Rosneft and Novotech. But in the bill's wording, which is on the government website, it is supposed to actually minimize competition. And so I guess it's sort of like a divide and conquer strategy for these gas companies. And my question is, to what extent is this kind of liberalization good for the Russian gas industry?
It is actually very good. I wish there was more liberalization taking place, obviously, but it's actually a good step in the right direction. Because what is important is not the factor of competition on the international markets between Russians. What is important is the lack of our presence in the global LNG market. That is the key priority for me. And it's very, very clear. It's just what I told in my previous speech, that best breakthroughs in LNG have been achieved by private initiative. Moreover, we can, refer to the current experience because the most advanced out of all greenfield LNG projects at the moment is the private project, the Novotech-led Yamal LNG project, which has formally nothing to do with the government, which is one more proof of the theory that if private contractors, private investors are allowed to do this, then more LNG facilities will be brought about in Russia, which is the ultimate goal. Now, speaking about competition, I'd say to me it looks like more a bit of an artificial scare used by Gazprom to hold on to its monopoly, rather than, we've had problems with competition between Russians at the international markets before. Like when all of a sudden oil exports was very quickly liberalized during the 90s. There were some facts of price dumping. Also similar thing in the coal industry when it was privatized and liberalized. Yes, there is always an initial phase when suppliers try to outplay one another by trying to use price dumping a little bit and compete with each other. However, all of them, particularly given the economics of LNG projects, particularly given the economics of new greenfield areas of Russia, which are very highly costly, if we seriously speaking about, we're talking about a few dollars per metric ton of LNG. No, I don't believe we ever, on the territory of a huge price differential that emerges because of competition, because these costs are obviously so high that investors are not fundamentally interested in lowering the price too much. It's not economic. So I think we have never actually seen a viable paper or study which might show, what a serious, brutal competition might look like, so it will bring down revenues. Again, to me, it sounds like more an artificial government. Key issue is that if we will be eventually present and playing on the global LNG market with real projects, these projects will be costly enough so that investors will not be interested to substantially bring down price, so that the government will get its fair share of the taxes. This is why, to achieve the ultimate goal, to introduce Russia on a more significant scale at the global LNG market, we need that liberalization taken a more significant scale. We actually need to completely exempt anybody who is expecting to build an LNG facility in Russia from any kind of restrictions regarding exports. Now it's the reverse model. Now they're going to issue licenses, basically, for allowing them to export the LNG. Government will issue a permit only if your license is containing, your upstream field license is containing the idea of building an LNG plant to evacuate the gas. We need to move on from that restricted format to complete liberalization of LNG exports whatsoever, without any government interference. We might lose certain money at some point because of Russians competing with each other, but the strategic advantages of taking significant share in the international gas market will be much bigger.
Thank you.
I think there was a question here.
Svetlana?
Dr. Mилov, thank you for your presentation. My question is, with regards to the ongoing anti-competition investigation against Gazprom, do you think this could provide an incentive for change of strategy in Eastern Europe in terms of export markets? And do you think it could, in a way, speed up the deal of the center with China?
Well, first, I tend to take this anti-competition investigation seriously. And I also do believe that Putin and Gazprom, they also do take it very seriously. Just to give you an illustration, immediately after news came that EU authorities are carrying out this investigation, they opened it. Very shortly, Putin had issued a specific decree prohibiting Gazprom to giving certain information to European Commission, or foreign regulatory authorities, which was, I believe, specifically driven by Gazprom to protect itself, referring to a force majeure, saying that we would love to give EU the papers, but the presidential decree prohibits us. This is how they want to present the case. However, now looking back, with all due respect to the European Union regulators, I strongly believe that the DG Comp and European competition regulators is one of the strongest regulatory institutions within the European Union, one of the best as far as achievements are concerned. There are other parts of Brussels bureaucracy which are far from being that efficient, but the competition part is good. However, I believe that the foundation of the positive changes at the European market and increasing competition in natural gas market, which I have been speaking about, have been laid by market forces, not by regulators. Regulators have played a largely supplementary and maybe even marginal role in this regard. But what was important is the natural, very natural process of development of production of non-conventional gas, particularly in North America, and increasing number of LNG regas terminals constructed in Europe, allowing it to receive more gas from overseas. These have played a much bigger role than all the regulations and investigations done by Brussels. So I think further challenges for Russia, Gazprom at the European market will be to a large extent, again, coming from these natural market sources. What we see, what is happening right now is developing interconnections, developing storage capacity, developing LNG capacity is spreading on to from Western Europe to Central and Eastern Europe. Now what we see is LNG terminals are being built and discussed in formerly complete Gazprom stronghold, Eastern Europe, which was totally dependent. Now we see Poland, Lithuania, Croatia, Romania, and so on. I think this is the biggest threat. Not any kind of investigations or regulatory actions from certain authorities, but something which changes the fundamentals of the situation, which brings choice to European consumers. Because if you have only one supplier and he violates competition law, I mean, you can punish him, all right. You can issue a felony or penalty for wrongdoing. Okay, you can force him to, you know, keep pipeline as a separate legal entity which is not participating in gas trade. Okay, but it's still one supplier physically. What you need is more suppliers. This is what is the most important part. So, it is largely driven not by regulators, but by the market forces. This is what will play the bigger role in the future, obviously.
It's my understanding that the role of Gazprom is kind of a socioeconomic benefit to the country, in that it gasifies areas, maybe remote places in Siberia. My question is, if the gas market is liberalized, who's going to kind of fulfill that role? What kind of investors would take that loss, gasify areas that are?
I'm not sure what loss specifically are you talking about?
It's just maybe not profitable to go sell gas to a really remote area, let's say like the Far East.
Well, at the Far East, at the remote areas, the gas often costs, if you calculate the net back with European price, in the remote areas of Russia, consumers sometimes pay higher than in certain European countries. So it's not the problem of remote areas. Remote areas pay big enough prices, and particularly when, you know, when I was visiting Far East 10 years ago, they had all these high hopes about Sakhalin gas coming, replacing the outdated coal. Now they virtually want coal back, because prices for coal have been incredibly stable over years, and gas is biting, is very expensive. So, and particularly, I think what was one of the negative consequences of rejecting the idea of unbundling Gazprom is that now basing on the current cost of production of gas at the Western Siberian fields, where the bulk of production is coming from, we have actually carried out a study, myself together with Sergei Chernavsky from Central Economic Mathematical Institute, exactly 11 years ago for the Ministry of Economic Development. We had tried to model the level of competitive gas price at the domestic market, which would have been achieved should we have like 5-6 independent private competing gas companies competing for a domestic consumer. Fair price, which would ensure good return on investment and at the same time stabilize at a certain level, will be $80–90 per thousand cubic meters, compared to like 110 average Russian consumers pay now, and a lot of industrial consumers actually pay more. So I think already with the program of gradual regulated increase of gas prices adopted, I think we already have bypassed the threshold of competitive gas price. Russian consumers are paying excessive price at the moment. And at the same time, look, some argue that this is needed because Gazprom is a big donor of Russian budget. It's not. It's not. Have a look. For instance, it is a wide known figure that like roughly 45% of the income of federal budget comes from oil and gas, of which this 40 percentage points comes from the oil industry and only 5 percentage points from Gazprom, given the fact that Gazprom, as far as the output is concerned, is bigger than the oil industry. You know why this is happening? Because in 2004, when there was a very, very significant increase in taxation for the oil industry, which was largely private at the time, gas industry was untouched and is largely still left untouched. Mineral extraction tax for gas industry is like $30 per 1,000 cubic meters, 30. Whereas for oil companies is like $130 per metric ton, which is a huge gap. So basically Gazprom is very heavily underpaying taxes to the government, despite the ability to take more and more from domestic consumers. What is even more important is that all these new projects, these streams, Blue Stream, Nord Stream, get, again, generous tax exemptions from the state. For instance, the gas transported to Turkey via Blue Stream pipeline that runs through Black Sea is completely exempt from export duties. Export duties is the main way Russian gas, which is exported, is taxed. It's zero. You can have a look. Have a look in the Russian state budget. You will see it. The Blue Stream goes. What is also interesting is also you can do that exercise by yourself. Take Gazprom's annual report, general and financial. What you can calculate on a year-to-year basis is the share of export duty within the export price. 10 years ago, it was high as 28%. 28% of the export price was paid in duties to the state. Now it's like 18 or 17, maybe. This level of drop of relative export duty this is because of a lot of untaxed gas exported via new pipelines. So, well, frankly speaking, if Gazprom is unbundled into a number of separate private companies, like take a look at the oil industry, we'll get more taxes from that. We'll get domestic prices stabilized. It's a completely win-win-win situation for everybody, except few people who are now benefiting from having the monopoly over the market. I hope I answered your question.
Thank you for being here. I've been in Russia 3 or 4 years already, and a lot of Russians, even liberals who travel abroad, speak English and all that, still feel that gas and oil are basically national treasures of Russia. And that it is in Russia, and I hear from them, no, that should always stay in state control. Even those who are against Putin. I just wanted to ask you, what is better for Russia, control over projects, or is it the high revenues from the projects?
I think I just clearly answered your question before. I have these arguments, I argue a lot about this with ordinary people, but I'm a head of a political party, so I have to deal with ordinary voters who have no clue, basically, because of the general notion and the propaganda, you know, el petróleo es nuestro and stuff like that, right? There's a generally positive attitude towards national control over resources because people think that it would eventually convert into benefits. It's a huge enlightenment work, which guys like me are busy with, to actually convince people that it's not the case. It's not the case. We get more from private industry for the benefit of the state than we get from all these guys. So I know where this public perception comes from. It comes from plain lack of knowledge of facts. I think what I try to encourage is, what I try to do today as well, is encourage a real good debate with figures, numbers, arguments, comparative analysis of effectiveness of state model and private model. Now, my understanding is that given the complexity of the international energy industry and energy markets, it's particularly, look, I know how bureaucracy works, particularly Russian. I have been inside. There is no room for such an outdated dinosaur decision-making system to actually get involved into such complicated projects as that. This is why everything is not moving over the past decade, which I had just explained. New projects are not moving, very slow. No success stories, no new field introductions, and so on. Success is largely happening in the private sector. So the division of labor to me is very simple. You invest, get your profits, we tax you, we get a contract, we agree how much we tax you, we follow the rules, you give the money to the state, the budget, you operate, get your profits, and take them away, do whatever. This is how it should work, plain and simple. And when such a principle was applied in the past 20 years of the history of the Russian energy industry, it did work very effectively. Still, private companies like Lukoil is paying like far more. It's like more than 5-6 times smaller than Gazprom, but it's paying far more taxes than Gazprom. Very, very simple argument. Just have a look at their books, at their IFRS reports.
Andrea?
So again, thank you so much for coming today. And I was wondering what your opinion was on the current relationship between Turkey and Russia in terms of the fact that earlier in your presentation you mentioned how Gazprom is dropping from 150 BCM exports to Europe and continues to drop. So you have that. Also in regards to the Southern Corridor projects, TAP and TANAP coming online, those run through Turkey. And then you also have Turkey's desire to increase progress towards an energy transit state, so a key critical energy transit state for that region. And also their attempts to decrease their dependence on Russian energy, and how they are looking at importing significant amounts of energy from northern Iraq, as well as from Middle Eastern suppliers, and possibly looking at Iran and Turkmenistan, although those seem like pipe dreams in the reality of things. But given these desires and the drop in BCM to Europe, do you think that Russia is going to view Turkey as somewhat of a threat, or are they going to continue to have a workable relationship, or is Turkey really never going to be enough of a transit state to be a threat to Russia?
Well, it's a very interesting question. Thank you very much. The situation is very uneven here. It's complicated. And, well, first is the aspect which is concerning Russia's gas exports to Turkey. It's very clear that Turkey is significantly improving Gazprom's balance sheet, because it is an exception from the otherwise declining European sales. Turkey has been rapidly increasing consumption of Russian gas, and that was the intentional strategy on the Turkish part. However, we have this. Recently, we've met with one of my old friends, a very good expert in the gas industry, who is more pro-Gazprom, but he's very professional and very knowledgeable. We had an all-night bitter conversation, rivalry argument about particularly this issue, because my point is that, okay, we export more volumes to Turkey, but what's the benefit from the Russian state? Because I just mentioned that the gas exported to Turkey via Blue Stream is untaxed. Assume that we tax this normally, impose export duties similarly as we do on the European market. Would Gazprom sell at the price it does? Would it be profitable? Big question. So, now this guy was arguing with a totally different type of argument. He's saying that the Turkish market is open for different sources. So we need to put our foot there. If we do not do, then somebody else would, and we'll lose the market. My point is that what's the point in stepping your foot and getting control of the market if you don't get profit from that for the state? If it goes complete, if the state receives zero taxes from these supplies, right? You can have your own opinion about that. I told you mine. I think we have given the taxation issue, which is vital, as far as that is the ultimate interest of my country. If we're talking about the national treasure, we need this national treasure to work for the benefit of Russian people and the interests of the country. If it doesn't, if it does not generate enough tax revenue maybe we're doing something wrong. Again, I'm calling for a complete revisiting of this whole idea of Turkish supplies. Again, when I talk to Gazprom people, I say it's not your gas, it is our gas. So you have to actually report to us how efficiently you use it and what did you bring back to the state for letting you produce and export it. Now, so there's a big controversy about whether this increasing and rapidly increasing Gazprom supplies to Turkey, are they beneficial to the country or not? Because again, if we take a look at the rest of Europe, in most cases, these supplies are taxed normally. You pay export duties as you should. Not in this case. This is why the exception, this is why it deserves a special discussion. Now, another aspect is general relations between Russia and Turkey. They have always been quite uneasy because clearly Turkey always wanted to promote itself as the transit energy hub for multiple sources, be it Caspian, Azerbaijan and potentially Turkmenistan, be it Iran, be it Kurdistan, what have you. Geographically speaking, Turkey is one of the few options for those who want to bypass Russian territory with transit to actually do so. So this is why, of course, Putin, Gazprom, and actually their predecessors, because a lot of this strategy was actually developing during Rem Vyacherev era at Gazprom regarding Turkey in particular. A lot of thinking this way was built on the notion that, okay, maybe if we please them somehow, if we grant them some concessions, advantages, gas contracts, and so on, they will not, again, as I told you, we would put, our foothold. So this is why we not let competitors in. However, Turkey always played a very independent role in discussing certain transit projects unrelated to Russia. Russia was always very jealous. There was obviously a long discussion about Russians versus Turks versus Europeans for buy-off of volumes of Azeri gas. Turkey wanted to be a major reseller of Azeri gas. So wanted Gazprom, which had offered itself in such capacity. Europeans wanted to buy directly, using Turkey as just a provider of transit services. A lot of this argument continues to this point. So it's a complicated story, and there is, as far as resisting growing potential of Turkey as an alternative transit hub, transporting non-Russian gas to competing non-Russian gas to European markets, I think there have been two elements to that. First is trying to please Turkey through establishing comfortable network of connections and supplies of Russian gas to outplay the others and potential competitors. And second, try to push and instigate pressure on certain European consumers to sort of, shy them away from temptation to buy alternative gas, like, Austria, for instance, or other countries like that. The Russians have specifically or Bulgaria, Greece, what have you. Russians have been specifically doing a lot to influence the decision makers in those countries to persuade them not to deal with either Nabucco or whatever other transit ideas and continue to rely on Russian gas. So the strategy is in a lot of ways to outplay Turkey on the other end of the pipeline, not to try to resist whatever Turkey is doing, because I think our decision makers understand that it's virtually impossible. But there has been plenty of problems with all that too. The controversial economics of Nabucco project, insufficient gas supply, problems with Turkmenistan. The key thing, when particularly Americans love to talk about Trans-Caspian project as a geopolitical thing. But I always ask them a simple question: how do you put together Turkmens and Azeris? The relations between them, Russians and Ukrainians, or let me say Indians and Pakistanis, are best friends compared to relations between Azerbaijan and Turkey. There are so many issues standing in between. Division of Caspian in the first place, which still goes unresolved, and Azerbaijan has always been, keeping in mind pretty similar philosophies Turkey has in mind versus Azerbaijan. If I am the country on the other end of a pipeline, let me buy it, and then I will decide what to do with the gas. But so there's been many years of ideas, but never anything which have brought it any closer to implementation. So Turkmen gas was always more than like a dream, speaking about practical delivery. But then again, Turkey remains a major challenge, major problem, a major transit competitor to Gazprom. Disregard of their relatively good and progressing relationships, Turkey still maintains a very solid independent approach to things, and I don't think Gazprom has much leverage to change that.
Svetlin?
You spoke about the success story of the coal market. Would you please briefly share your views on the electricity market? Because that wasn't covered.
The electricity market is not as a successful story as one might hope for, unfortunately. Now, in April 2003, right in the middle of the whole developments with the electricity reform in Russia, we wrote a memo for Gref and Chubais together with Evgeny Yasin. It was just dual memo signed by myself and Evgeny Yasin, the chairman of the Higher School of Economics, or what is his correct title at the moment. We have been specifically warning about one major issue, which I think still is a key issue of the whole electricity reform. It's very similar to what I've spoken about regarding gas. If we would not achieve a market structure which would ensure a sufficient number of independent players, privately owned, not connected with each other and interested in competing with each other, then the whole electricity reform might have certain effect, positive effect. If the ownership of generation will be more cartel type, very limited number of players somehow connected, particularly connected to the state, then it could turn out to be a disaster. Growing electricity prices, lack of competition, no private investment in upgrading the capital stock of power generation companies. Unfortunately, you clearly see that things went on by a second scenario, and I think there are two things which have contributed to that. One is the general pattern of developments in the Russian energy sector and the economy, which we did not envisage at the moment. You know, when we drafted the first concepts of electricity reform back in 2000, 2001, we had no clue that, for instance, Gazprom would not only remain as a state-controlled monopoly, but would start buying electricity companies. It was a nightmare. If we only have been told, I mean, we would have spent all the time trying to do something to prevent it from happening. Because I also believe that it's a very unfortunate development for a competitive power market when fuel companies start to interfere and get integrated with power stations, because it distorts the fuel market. very significantly imposes obstacles on the competition, because you can use fuel supplies as a leverage in influencing your competitors, which is something that Gazprom is currently doing, obviously. So we had no idea that Gazprom would be a major player in power generation. We also had no idea that the government will stay to that level, which it currently does, because initially, when the first configuration of wholesale generation companies was adopted by the government on the 1st September of 2003 with a governmental resolution, there was 4 hydro generation companies included in the list. There was no such thing as Rus Hydro, which is a monster owned by the state at the moment. Only later, government had amended this whole configuration and integrated the 4 separate hydropower generation companies into one, Rus Hydro, which was called Gidro OGK initially. And also, initially we intended that hydropower generation companies will be also privatized. But basically, when we passed the legislation in the Duma in 2002, communists and others had insisted, and we had to give it away as compromise, which was very unfortunate, that government retains more than 50% control over hydro generation, which was one of the compromises for the, I think very unfortunate, but still. So, you know, piece by piece, Gazprom, Hydro, eventually we've achieved a situation when the state did not exit power generation, and the state-affiliated companies have actually retained control. What is also important is that initially we had hoped for a much bigger pool of potential investors interested. There was UCAS around. Generally, private sector in Russian economy as such have been very badly damaged during the recent years. You see many groups are exiting, many business groups are exiting large vital businesses and so on. We hope that there will be much bigger number of both Russian private players and, what is important, international private players. What have happened in the Russian power industry is that we did not achieve what we hoped. I believe that current ownership of power generation companies by German E.ON and Italian Enel is largely a trade-off because I think strategically they want to swap it for some kind of deals related to gas industry. I don't think that they view themselves as long-term strategically present in the electricity. I think it's rather a more complex strategy because they want to use the participation in the electricity sector as a part of a general trade-off with Gazprom on gas issues. So we really don't have these clean and pure foreign investors in power generation as well. So there's no competition. Most capacity is still under control of a state or state-affiliated companies. Large business groups, virtually a cartel, which is very effectively influencing the pricing environment. So this is not what we hoped for. And the other factor, apart from this, unfortunate but eventually, objective course of events, I think also a contributing factor was the bad will of Chubais, who had contributed very negatively to this whole process, because I have had many talks with him personally on the issue, stressing that, Mr. Chubais, there is no such other important thing in the whole electricity reform as establishing a real competitive environment in power generation. And that should be only achieved by taking care of whom do you sell to. He clearly he said, that's not an issue, I'm not concerned. I think it generally originates from his historical experience, genetic experience of being a big privatizer, the way he understands that process. He was mostly concerned with proceedings. How much do they earn from selling a generation asset? To whom? Don't care. Deripaska, Gazprom, Let them come. Competitive environment on the market, not my business. I quit in 2008 and take care of nanotechnologies, whatever. It's not my something which I would, build my legacy on is how much money I have earned through power generation auctions. Not to whom it goes and what structural environment would exist. He clearly didn't care about this thing, which had contributed greatly and negatively to the virtually non-competitive environment that we currently have at the electricity market.
Jack?
Again, thank you so much for a fascinating talk and for answering all of our questions. To bring it back to gas, it seems to me that the limited liberalisation of LNG exports is you could almost see it in some ways as somewhat of a slight punishment to Gazprom by the government, saying, well, you guys had the chance, you should have developed our presence on the global LNG market, and you guys failed, right? And so your punishment is that these other trusted national companies, will be able to step in and participate in this, right? And you mentioned as well, absolutely rightly, I think that Gazprom is losing its market share in Europe as well towards pipeline gas exports. The market is becoming more competitive. We're not only seeing a more active European Commission with the anti-monopoly investigation, but also just basic supply-side competition as well, right? And again, you pointed out absolutely rightly that the environment is becoming absolutely more and more competitive for Gazprom, and the gas that they are producing is also becoming more and more expensive. The gas that they're taking from Balanynkova is absolutely more expensive than the gas that they took from Urengoy or Medvedje, right? So what I'm curious is this: how much of their market share do you think that they have to lose? How much do they have to fail in their basic commercial aim of running a profitable gas export business in Europe before the Russian government will step in and say, okay, now we're going to allow maybe Novatek, maybe even if Rosneft meets their target of producing 100 BCM of gas by 2020, maybe they will be allowed some. Again, limited, I'm not expecting absolute liberalization of gas exports, but can you see a situation where this same limited competition is allowed, where the Russian government starts to believe it is more important that we retain some market share in Europe, and that this is actually more important than the complete control through Gazprom?
Well, thank you. You actually have incorporated several different questions, and I try to answer them all. First, the question is about thinking and vision of marketing policy. Now, to me, when I speak and when you listen to me, it might seem obvious that losing market is not good. But don't rush, because these guys might see, there's an old Soviet anecdote. Gazprom is pretty much a Soviet enterprise still. It was never reformed. It was just, a bunch of guys from St. Petersburg with nice suits and ties introduced on top. But still, it's in a lot of ways pretty much a Soviet enterprise. It was a very old Soviet joke about a deputy director of a Soviet enterprise on marketing and sales, who once came and called his department and says, guys, you have to congratulate me. I got rid of all our clients, so we might not do anything in the office and still receive salary. Now, why I use that joke is that I was watching once, I woke up in the morning, switched Russia 24 channel, and literally I nearly dropped my cup of coffee because I heard a woman host saying the following text. Yesterday, the board of directors of Gazprom was deciding on the revised marketing strategy in Europe, and basically they had a dilemma, she says. Like she understands what she means. She says whether to sell more gas in volumes at a discounted price or to sell less gas but at a higher price. And then she said with very happy expression on his face, they have taken the right decision to agree to sell less gas but at a higher price. Which now eventually, mechanics of how that works is very clear in the case of Ukraine. Before Russia launched this intensive price wars on Ukraine, in 2007, we have sold 54 BCM of gas to Ukraine. In the past couple of years, it was around 30 BCM, plus these fluctuations. First, I don't have statistics for 9 months. Gazprom haven't published it yet. Have a look at their ФСФР reports, quarterly отчеты эмитента, это называется, right? They publish volumes by country. First half of this year, Ukraine, 9.6, less than 10 BCM in half a year, which might eventually get you to a little more than 20 for 12 months, compared to 54 just 6 years ago. That happens when you over-push with this strategy of a Russia 24 hostess of a Soviet enterprise marketing and sales deputy director, right? So actually, frankly speaking, I don't see any signs of concern among top decision makers, because I believe that the philosophy, unfortunately, is still on defending the high price. Now, it's like guys like Milov are running around with presentations showing all this. Eventually, you will not find numbers, which I mentioned, circulating around big time. No, you have to look. You have to analyze the reports. It's not the mainstream analysis that we have lost the market. People raise eyebrows when I say that in a lot of audiences. So I don't see this being a big matter of concern, unfortunately. I hope it eventually will become. Now, speaking about LNG, you're right when you say that Vladimir Putin understands that we're kind of outdated because we do not have a lot of LNG projects. Yes, all of us now, for many, many years, he has been brainwashed with the idea that we need more pipes. This stream, that stream, third stream, fourth stream, many, many streams, right? Now, eventually, when he takes a look at what, no, he has his own analysis of what happens at the international gas market. Now, you can't ignore the growth in LNG, because all of a sudden the small fly becomes so big, more resemblant of an elephant. You cannot, unnotice that. So he noticed. This is why he calls for all these people and say, well, как же вы допустили? How come? Why we're not players here? So yes, he is concerned about Russia becoming a big player on LNG, but I think that is more about concern about Russia being not present in the global LNG environment, rather than the whole systemic analysis of our marketing strategy, of our revenues and vision of export policy and so on. I don't think we have a coherent vision at the moment. This is why such big difficulties and bitter arguments about liberalization of LNG. Speaking of limited competition, I don't view it as a competition as such. I view it as rather a systemic bargain between several different clans which are very close to Putin, and whom he cannot refuse when they... Sechin, Timchenko, Miller, the triangle, right? And it looks like when for instance, have a look at a very important situation developing in the Russian Far East. Gazprom wants to build Vladivostok LNG. At the same time, there is a proposal to upgrade Sakhalin to Aniva Bay LNG facility existing at the southern part of Sakhalin Island. At the same time, Sechin comes up with idea of building an LNG plant together with Exxon in the framework of Sakhalin 1. Impossible to implement all the three projects together, just not enough gas. Do you see Putin interfering? No. Very important point for you to watch. When he interferes in that very, very clear situation, it's ultimately very clear every person who is not even familiar in detail with this whole market situation will tell you that there's not enough gas for 3 new LNG projects. You have to at least choose 2. Whenever Putin interferes and makes an ultimate decision that, you know, we go with this and this is, you know, way too risky because not enough resources, means that he has a strategy. If he does not interfere, it means that he's just acting as an arbiter in this administrative bargain between different influential clans, trying to maneuver between themselves, rather than having a, you know, this vertical vision, command vision on how to do this or do that. At the moment, I'd say it's more like a maneuvering, more like a bargain, rather than a decisive Putin acting as part of his coherent strategy. Just recall what happened exactly a year ago when Sechin gave an interview to Wall Street Journal. I think it was published the 2nd of November last year, when he actually went on Timchenko, saying that, commenting on Novatek's plans to export LNG from Yamal directly, bypassing Gazprom. Sechin said that it's no good, it's not patriotic. His position had turned around many times since then, but he said it's against, we should keep the monopoly, it's against the interests of Russian Federation and so on. Next day, Putin interfered. He didn't say anything about Sechin, but he met with Michelson, head of Novatek, and tried to reassure the markets that, no, don't worry, the project of Yamal LNG will go on and so on. He didn't, you know, try to downplay anything what Sechin have said and so, which is again to me an illustration that he's more trying to maneuver between different clans, all of which are kind of precious to him, important to him. These clans have become bigger and bigger over years. It's right now not very easy to demolish or significantly damage one against the other. So he has to try to balance their interests. I think it's more about balancing interests rather than about strategy and competition being instigated, at least on a limited scale.
Thank you.
Stephanie?
Would it be all right if I asked a question that's not related to energy?
Sure.
Okay. Thank you for your presentation on energy, though. Earlier you referenced that you're a participant in a strategic rivalry of political ideas in Russian domestic politics. And I was wondering, when you're interacting with these voters, what is the biggest misperception that Russian voters have of their government? And also, what are the biggest challenges your party faces, and how do you plan on dealing with those?
Well, it's a simple question in a way, because I have to say that the real problem for the Russian voters is information blockade, lack of awareness of the real situation in the country. Because generally speaking, Russian voters are very rational. They are very easy to deal with, very comfortable to me. Because, well, my idea, the key slogan of my party is competition versus monopoly. We want to dismantle monopolies and encourage competition everywhere, among political parties, among media, among economic market players and so on. Now, people understand this perfectly, because this concerns everything connected with their pockets. They pay higher rates for communal services because of lack of competition. They have huge problems on where to invest their pension savings because lack of competition. Many other things, right? So the problem is, this is why for us, we've talked about that regarding the energy, raising awareness, enlightenment, because now, you know, people have a lot of perceptions like Gazprom is something which feeds the whole country. This is, you know, they promote their TV ads called National Treasure, Национальное достояние, creating an image like without Gazprom we will die tomorrow. If there is no, this is the idea that is promoted. Now, when we explain that Gazprom is you know, paying only a small fraction of taxes to the budget than it should, that is constantly raising prices, hurting the economy, hurting businesses, hurting people. Frankly speaking, when people have no clue, they start to scratch their heads and revisit the whole understanding of how country works and so on. Now, for instance, importantly, when you speak about economic policy, for instance, government spending, taxation, now people believe that generally it is perceived that most of the increase, we had federal budget outlays increased twice in the recent 5 years. They were 6.5 trillion rubles in the beginning of 2008, and it's about 13.5 trillion rubles now, with the relevant increase of taxation. The highest increase in non-mineral sector taxation in 20 years. Which did hurt a lot of businesses, economic development. You see economy is brought to a stagnation. Now people believe that most of the additional spending is because of the social programs. Now we tell them that it's not. That it's on subsidizing the firms and companies close to government, and it's spending more on police and security services, increasing government apparatus and staff of bureaucrats. We had a million civil bureaucrats in 2000, we have 1.6 million now. So when we talk about, people are unaware. They believe that all this extra budget spending, extra taxation is because of the social programs. We say, no, there's still room to finance more social programs if you reduce that unnecessary costs. Subsidies to ineffective enterprises, so-called national economy, which is largely subsidization of different forms of economic activity, is currently 1.7 trillion in the federal budget. It was the biggest growing part of the budget in the recent 5-6 years, and that is actually the outright price which was paid for the greater interference of government in the economy. See, we've taken more taxes from effective private businesses, and we redistribute this money to those who cannot live without government subsidies. This is how it works. Now, when you talk to people about that, when you tell them facts, figures, they become very interested. But basically, they want to learn it. They have not enough sources of information to get it from, because state propaganda says obviously different things. So we have to do it better. We have to more effectively engage in enlightenment work and explaining people in very plain and simple language, as I do now, how all these things work and how we can make it better. This is, I mean, it's not a fast process, but it works.
And what about the challenges to your party?
Multiple. Largely is, again, information blockade. It's very difficult. More than 90% of the Russian people have television as the main source of information. And that is, newspapers is just like 25. And TV channels and major nationwide newspapers are controlled by the state. So you can imagine how often they invite guys like us. No, sometimes, but to just demonstrate that, you know, we have limited competition for the 30-second commentary, not on Gazprom, mostly on some, you know, routine election processes and so on. But that is the biggest obstacle. As soon as we get, and to get to people directly, print your own materials, brochures, newspapers, go door to door, arrange meetings with people and so on. That's costly. It's not very easy to get money for opposition parties, because, you know, businesses, they are interested in success. And the big question is, how do you come to power? I mean, I can explain for hours our strategy, or how do we want to come to power, but businessmen, they always want a very, very clear and viable illustration of how you get from point A to point B. That's difficult to get. So we are not flush with money, to say the least. So we have to, you know, but generally speaking, it works. It's a very slow, very routine process. Our key strategy is to try to build on from grassroots. Do not rush necessarily to run for president. Try local level. Build a network of representation in local constituencies, regional assemblies, address local issues, try to help people improve lives on a very practical level. This is what they get through political instruments. This is what they get. This is what they understand. When in the local constituency they get at least one elected municipal deputy who is not representing a bunch of, oligopoly guys in power, but is independent, is meeting people, is trying to introduce local legislation which meets the needs of people. It raises huge interest, huge support. So through that, we will only be able to bring about competitive environment in politics if we build on from this local grassroots level, and there is no other way around. You cannot start with big issues. You have to start with very small, practical, local problems.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I have one last question. Perhaps you already gave parts of answers to it. Let's get back to the topic of this presentation. So you've been illustrating so far your view on the benefits brought about by privatization and the shortcomings that were related to this centralized system of national champions. Yet there are success stories out there of vertically integrated companies not in Russia who could bring benefits to their countries, who could bring about good results for in the nation's interest. So what makes Russia different with other countries? I may think about Norway or others. Is it a problem related to bureaucracy, to the excessive bureaucratization? You mentioned that Gazprom is a Soviet enterprise in a way. The problem may be the use of resource rents in the regime's interest or for the clans that gravitate around it. And ultimately, may we say that, or may you subscribe to the view that Russia has and definitely is suffering from a resource curse?
I have slightly different vision of the problem of resource curse compared to some other economists who tend to blame everything on that. I think that one can actually develop well enough being a resource-based economy. Australia, Canada, Norway, Brazil in a lot of ways, right? So it's not necessarily a curse. It depends on how you use it. Speaking about examples of efficiency of state companies in the world, unfortunately, I haven't written but unpublished book on energy in general, but particularly Russian. I need to publish it, but I have several graphs about comparative efficiency there of different international private and state-controlled companies. Now, one conclusion, you might take a look yourself, be it, earnings per employee, revenues per employee, different indicators of efficiency and productivity. Now, I do not deny that there are certain state-controlled companies in some countries in the world which might be considered as efficient by different criteria. However, few things. These companies are an overwhelming minority and exception compared to the whole bunch of state-controlled oil and gas companies in the world. Mm-hmm. Normally people mention Petrobras, Statoil, a couple of others, that's it. As a general rule, again, effective state company, such a thing might exist, even in practice, not only in theory. But that's still a big exception from a general rule. Another important part is that if you take a look closer, there is always an argument, even though they are ahead of the others in certain issues, there is always a bitter argument going on within certain countries where these companies operate and whether they're effective or not. Now, Statoil. Just, go to Norwegian parliament and listen to all these eternal, permanent discussions on whether Statoil is efficient or not. This has been going on for ages, and there are many people who doubt that its funds are used effectively and so on. So it's not an absolute story. When the state is involved, when the public interest is involved, when you have this division of labor, like you do everything yourself but pay good taxes, I mean, we're even. The state and the investor is even in this situation. Now, when the state is in control of a company, there is always a public perception that we need to get more. Because it's ours, it needs to be more efficient. I have been mentioning a lot of these things regarding Russian oil and gas industry, like, is Rosneft paying enough dividends or not? Same issue about Statoil in Norway, believe me, and I'm sure some of you are aware that in Norway they have more questions about efficiency of Statoil than international oil and gas community does. And the third important thing, if you take a look at the history of state versus private industry in energy in different countries, there is a very, very clear trend which is associated with the fact that whenever there's been some openness to private investment, foreign investment, things have significantly improved. Brazil, for instance. Now, Petrobras is a relatively good company, but development of oil production in Brazil, particularly complicated offshore projects, had actually started to boost after, in the 1990s, the legislation was adopted which provided much freer environment for participation of private and international investors. So was the case of Norway. Norway is not just Statoil. A lot of international companies are also operating there as well. Well, if you take a look at Latin American or African countries, it's my favorite story, because in like 1970s we had a shockwave of nationalizations happened. In most countries output was brought down, never came back. A lot of examples, Kuwait, Libya, whoever. Take a look at Venezuela. During 1990s, when there was a totally different, before Chavez, when there was a totally different policy with PDVSA, investment started to grow, production started to grow, efficiency started to grow. Chavez came to power, everything down again. So, speaking about dynamics and trends, it's a very clear trend. The more openness, more participation of private sector, more participation of foreign investors, the better overall results and different indicators of success. It has certain exceptions, but there is a general trend which is, I think, very hard to deny based on the international experience, and I need to finally publish the book about that.
Okay, I have one last question, if
Please.
I may. I know you've been speaking for 2 hours and 40 minutes already.
I still have political debates this evening.
Okay, so you should save your voice maybe for...
It's okay, yeah.
Okay, very quickly. Well, this may be interesting for our students. I was wondering, what could you tell us about the current level of, the quality of the PRs of companies such as Gazprom and Rosneft? How, because I have the impression that these big companies still lack of specialized, multilingual specialists in international relations and public relations, namely lobbyists. For example, in Brussels, Gazprom didn't have a real lobbying office in Brussels until recently, I believe, or maybe they still haven't one. They are outsourcing it to young, not even very specialized people, and I was wondering, what do you know about this? What could you tell us?
We've had, again, an eternal argument with them. Like 10, 12 years ago, we had specifically talked to Gazprom people about this. I have been telling some of them, I said, guys, European market inevitably will become more competitive, more open. It's not going to become less dependent on you and your long-term contracts. Contrary, there will be more competition one way or another. You have to go learn how to deal in an open competitive environment, open trading structures, try to develop normal, friendly regulatory affairs, not lashing out at Brussels every time it does something, saying, oh, stupid Brussels people. Don't go like that. Be gentle. I mean, talk to them, encourage them, and so on. Now, I think what we're seeing is it's just not lack of PR. It's the aftertaste of this whole vision that existed 10 years ago, was dominant still, and which I explained in the beginning of my presentation. That the ultimate pattern of development of international energy markets is importing countries becoming more dependent on us and actually coming begging on their knees for more oil and gas, and we're going to keep them in line waiting and maybe give somebody something. That was the general perception. This aftertaste is still very much present, and a lot of behavior like snubbing Brussels, which can do a lot of harm to Gazprom. It's no good snubbing them. It's not fruitful. It doesn't bring dividends. It brings you harm. But it's the aftertaste of that vision that we are so damn important, so that everybody will come begging for our energy, and we'll keep them waiting behind the door for a couple of hours, and then maybe we'll see. This is, I think, you have to get rid of the whole attitude that you are not that important as you previously thought. You have to compete with others on more or less equal basis, which is, it requires a whole, review of thinking and revising whole your strategic approach to things. It's just not a problem of the quality of PR. This goes back from the top. The signal sent from the top is that we're cool and these guys are not worth it and let's snub them. Well, the PR guys, I mean, they get precisely the signal which they are given, that they understand who is cool, so they actually promote that among others. This is why you say that they're ineffective. I completely agree, but cannot be any other way. I cannot imagine Rosneft or Gazprom PR guys in a current vertical czarist system coming, sort of knocking on the table and saying, guys, you top managers, you do everything wrong. Stop it. Rethink what you're doing. It gives you bad consequences. Can you imagine a PR manager doing a thing like that? He gets fired the other minute. So they're basically, they are simply translating outside the signals that they get on top from managers who think that they're still cool. And shale gas is just a bubble which will burst in a couple of days. This is why bad PR. Bad PR is just a consequence of that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.